useful for you, but not all. But I think you'll be able to figure out when we're talking about extreme cold versus extreme hot. So our two main speakers today will be Andrew Millward, who is from Ryerson University. And he did, along with his team, the research that we're going to present on salt. This was looking at salt in intensive, very dense urban areas, looking at why we were losing trees. And Adam Nicklin, who works for the firm called Public Work, is a landscape architect, and he lives in Toronto, works in Toronto, and has been exploring tree issues with me, Adam, I guess for at least 30 years or so, maybe not quite that long, but a while. And he is really quite passionate about trees and always asking interesting questions of me. And he's going to talk about some of the options that we as designers have in our work. At the bottom of this slide are the principal partners that we have at the Tree Fund to make all of this happen. We are really pleased with the people who are partners. Missing from this page are landscape architects, and I really would like to see some landscape architecture firms as crown, diamond, or platinum partners. We already have some firms that are silver partners, and the ASLA is also a silver partner of the Tree Fund. And so we'd like to see some of the better, larger landscape architecture firms move up and be on this page. Next slide. Andrew, next slide. There we go. So I also want to just introduce the Tree Fund. It is an organization that does research and education in the areas of urban trees and urban tree care issues. I am a trustee on the Tree Fund board. We have over almost $4 million in funding right now. Our endowment that supports scientific research, education, and scholarships for aspiring tree care professionals. In 2018, we started a new endowment campaign called the Tree and Soil Research Fund for Landscape Architecture. We really are making a push to bring landscape architects into the Tree Fund. And I saw a lot of landscape architects, many I recognized as you were signing in. And thank you for your support. And we hope that we'll see more and more landscape architects contributing to this endowment fund for landscape architecture. We also have started providing LACIS CEUs for landscape architects for our webinar. I'm really thankful for the support from Deeproot, who is supporting the LACIS CEUs. Next slide. So as an introduction, we think of salt as a problem, and it's complex. Typically, tree decline in salt in most cities is not the single issue related to tree decline, but it can be. So when you start seeing as much salt and all that white stuff on the ground, there is not snow but salt, where the shopkeeper is salting, the city is salting, and then everybody starts salting again. There's zero tolerance for any ice or snow on the sidewalk, and the trees in this particular area don't stand a chance. We also need to always understand the science of trees is much easier to understand than the relationship between trees and people. So Andrew can do wonderful research that says we need to do whatever we need to do to keep the trees alive, but getting that idea out on the ground is tough. And I've learned that in 40 years of working in this particular area of landscape architecture. Next slide. So when we talk about salt, it's important to understand that salt impacts trees in two ways. And one is salt that melts on the sidewalk, flows into the tree planting space as salt laden water, resides in the soil, and then causes problems with the tree uptaking water during its growing period the following spring and summer. The second is airborne salt. So salt is put on the road, the car drives over the road, and if you're following that car, your windshield is going to start turning white. Well, that same thing is happening to the trees, and the buds are being coated with salt, and that's killing off buds. And so you typically, with airborne salt, begin to see dead branches with the tree, forcing out new buds in the spring further back in the tree. Trees that are tolerant of soil-borne salt are not necessarily tolerant of airborne salt because of the different mechanism that the salt causes. So when you're looking at salt tolerance, you have to really look at your local trees and see what is working for you. Next slide. So there are many factors in what makes salt a problem, but soils, the drainage in that soil, the topography and land use all contribute to the impact of salt. The one thing that we're seeing in really difficult salt places like Toronto is the more density in the urban area. So as you get deeper and deeper into the central business district, the greater the salt problems. And as you get more and more open space, older neighborhoods or suburban areas or parks, we have less salt problems. So that's kind of a basic thing. So if you're thinking of salt tolerant trees in your city, you may be able to use one particular kind of tree or one particular solution in a suburban setting that doesn't work in the CBD, and the downtown solution might be way more money and expense than you actually need as you get into less and less land use. Next slide. I think I'm turning this. Oh, yes. So some of the other factors in salt damage are soil type and soil drainage, the actual design of the tree space, tree species, nursery stock, things that landscape architects control, the salt type, the application frequency, the dosing, and then other environmental factors such as if the tree is in sun or shade, wind, microclimates all impact the stress of the tree and increasing the salt damage. So I'm going to turn this over to Andrew Millward, who's going to talk about his work. I forgot that when we're dealing with salt problems, salt impacts lots of other things. So there are ecological impacts where the salt enters the water stream, groundwater. There are very significant human health impacts. There's damage to infrastructure, particularly concrete and steel, and the cost in northern areas is really high. So if we're going to make changes to the way salt is used, we're going to have very little success in saying the trees are dying to the public works department and saying use less salt. But these other impacts really are the ACE card that we're going to have to work with to try to get less salt and different salt uses in the public realm. So I think that's it. And Andrew is going to present the research that he did.
Okay, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Andrew Millward, and just by way of introduction, I work at Ryerson University, which is located right in downtown Toronto. In fact, the two studies I'll speak to you about today are within walking distance of campus. So anybody conducting research in this particular realm, it's pretty ideal. For the last decade or so, I've run an urban forest research group here, and our focus has spanned everything from multidisciplinary work that deals with the socioeconomic or socioecological rather dimensions of urban forestry. We use a lot of geospatial technologies in our work, and more recently have been working on quite a micro scale and individual tree scale in some cases to understand reasons for tree decline and think about ways in which we might be able to grow more successful urban forests. Okay, so as I mentioned then, I'll be presenting work that we've conducted here in the city of Toronto. The first study occurred on Bloor Street. Bloor Street, affectionately referred to here, this portion of the street anyway, as Mink Mile. It's one of Canada's most upscale shopping districts, and I think one of Jim's photographs, in fact, was from the Mink Mile there, where he showed the excessive salt that had been applied there. Salting, of course, in front of retail, often a very popular thing to do. Retailers extremely concerned, as we all know, about liability, litigation-related issues, and as most of us will realize, it's a big driver of the application of salt in these very dense urban environments, especially shopping districts. So in 2015, we had the opportunity to work on Bloor Street. The area had experienced a significant decline in mortality of a London plane tree planting exclusively of London plane trees as a part of a large revitalization of the streetscape that occurred in 2010. So 5 years on then, major decline in trees and mortality allowed us then to sort of get in and try to tease out some of the influences or factors that might be driving that. Salt, of course, was on our list, but it wasn't the only factor. As Jim pointed out in his last slide, there's a variety of reasons, of course, that trees don't perform well in very dense urban contexts. So this first study, characterized here by the paper, if anybody's interested in learning more about it, you can find it in Arboriculture and Urban Forestry, talks about our broader scale study. The findings then, as I'll point out shortly, point strongly toward the influence of salt, and that was the impetus for the second study I'll share with you. Okay, so welcome to Bloor Street. 2010, as I mentioned, there was a significant streetscape revitalization, which resulted in the planting of 133 London plane trees, a monoculture of trees here. This tree in particular argued to be a value of interest because of the aesthetics that it provided, and I think that the business association associated with this particular area was a strong advocate for having that homogeneity of tree cover, and the London plane tree was then selected in this case. As I mentioned a few minutes ago, then decline and death of many of these trees was witnessed over the 5-year period, which resulted in 2015 in the wholesale replanting. And this replanting effort involved a more mixed species, many of which were cultivars of elm and a variety of other trees that are known to do well. The images that you're looking at here on the left, you can see some of the retail, and on the right-hand side, then a tree that's more or less met its fate here. It has died. In the background, you can see several trees that have a very sparse canopy associated with them. Okay, this is an overview then of the streetscape. approximately a quarter mile, a little bit less than a quarter mile of streetscape that was investigated here. And we looked at sampling of primarily trees that were planted in pit plantings or right into the street, as well as bed planters. And we were very interested in whether or not there was an influence of the planting condition or the infrastructure that surrounded the trees as a potential predictor of damage or access to various pollutants, for example, that may run off the streetscape and make their way into the growing medium. So you can also see sort of a general overview. Those of you who are not familiar with Toronto here, we're on the north side of Lake Ontario, and the two study sites within the city represented there as stars. A few examples of working conditions here. You can see a colleague of mine, James Steinberg, and also Jim Urban there working on the left-hand side, beginning to investigate some of the soil in terms of some of the soil-related measurements we've taken, which I'll share with you in a moment. And on the right-hand side, then, we were a part of all of the excavations that took place to get an understanding, again, below ground of the growing environment in which these trees had lived for that 5-year period. One thing I should mention, both of the projects I'm talking about today involve underground structural soil cells. So underneath these sidewalks, then are structural soil cells, and that was obviously a big investment on the part of the city in both of these cases as a way to try to promote and enhance tree growth in a very dense urban environment. So these tree cutouts were one of the types of design features studied. If I move to my next slide here, the second was then the raised planter, sometimes referred to as a curb surround. And on the left-hand side there, you can see the Ontario line clearing crew who worked on this project, again, giving us a really good idea of the root growth of the trees, that had been at this site for 5 years. How well the root system was developed and the direction of those roots. Are they, heading down deeper? Are they sending out more lateral growth? And on the right-hand side here, we have colleague James Steinberg, who was heavily involved in this first project. We had the crew there clean off the root system to give us a better indication then of overall root growth. So here are the data that we collected in summary. We looked at soil-related data. You can list, or you can see rather underneath the measurements there, the types of data that were collected. And these were based on 57 total soil samples at a 25 centimeter or just less than a foot in depth, or 12 inches in depth. And in terms of the tree assessments, we were interested in whether we encountered the tree dead or alive, and for living trees, then a general foliar condition was assigned to it. We used those data then in some statistical models to try to determine which of these factors then might be more significant in terms of drivers as they relate to tree decline and mortality. One thing that we did explore in a virtual environment using a geographic information system, some modeling as it relates to incoming light or canopy exposure to light within this is a very densely built street corridor. And while it doesn't appear on this table here, it did go into our modeling efforts to see whether light availability was a significant driver in some of the tree. So our findings in summary here point toward then the importance of growing location, so the type of architectural design in which trees were found. So the first point, obviously showing us here, the purpose of our talk today, that sodium and magnesium, which are residuals of road salt, typically are road salt applied most commonly still in this part of Ontario, and I think in many parts of the United States, is in the form of sodium chloride. So sodium then and magnesium residue in the soil is a strong indication then of the application of road salts or de-icing salts. So we found that at elevated levels in all soil conditions. Greater concentrations, though, were determined in conditions, in growing conditions for trees that we encountered in poor condition, or trees that were encountered dead at the time of our study. We also looked at electroconductivity, which is a good proxy then for salts within the soil. It doesn't necessarily identify specifically the various elements like sodium and magnesium, but it does give us an indication, generally speaking, about salinity levels. We did find that electroconductivity was elevated in these soils as well. Interestingly, and perhaps in support of our hypothesis going into this, trees in raised beds had better survival rates, and their canopy were found in better condition than trees that were planted right within the sidewalk itself. And that's obviously a fairly important finding in terms of streetscape architecture and design that Adam will be speaking to us about at toward the end of our webinar today. I mentioned this light modeling study that we undertook, and we did find that solar radiation was a significant predictor in canopy condition. Unfortunately, when we have multi-story towers surrounding the streetscape, it's very little we can do about access to light, except that, when we're planning the types of tree species selected in the first place to go in these streetscapes, there's a real importance, in my view, of trying to understand light availability conditions, because certainly a selection of a tree that would require high degrees of sunlight wouldn't always survive well in conditions like what were encountered in our study. The other variables we looked at didn't seem to be as strongly correlated, in most cases then weren't significant in terms of predicting canopy decline and mortality. So that's a summary then of some of these earlier findings of the broader streetscape study at Bloor. And where they point to, I think, is the importance of salt, and salt as a fairly significant driver then in tree decline. So in that same year, 2015, the City of Toronto was also completing a revitalization of its Queen's Quay Boulevard, which is immediately north of our waterfront. And that was in preparation for the Pan Am Para-Pan Am Games. And so we had an opportunity to go down there and begin to look at salt-related conditions, specifically following that. So following the 2015 plantings along Queen's Quay, which were also planted exclusively with London plane tree, these trees began to decline quite rapidly. And many were wondering, is this the same thing repeating itself in terms of what was witnessed on Bloor Street? Okay, so before I go into that second study in more detail, I just wanted to say a few things about salt in general. So sodium chloride then, perhaps the most commonly applied type of road salt, and reasons for it, safety motivated, of course, as we've pointed out then. And in a lot of cases, when residents or individuals maintaining commercial spaces are applying salt, it's a fairly cheap thing to acquire. It does work well in many contexts unless it gets too cold. So where a little is good, maybe more is better. And trying to understand that and provide more education to people about the fact that excessive salt application is really causing a lot of problems to our vegetation, among other things in an urban area, is really an important thing we need to all think about in our efforts to try to support tree growth in cities, but support other things that salt may be having an impact on. Along the lines of the education then is often an imprecise application. And so what I'm showing here then is a picture in front of a doorway where we can see huge clusters of rock salt here. So when we talk about imprecise application or over application, I think this is just a great example of this. Salt, although it can be highly toxic, is to a large degree unregulated, at least in most conditions. And so I would suggest we all think about perhaps the need for greater regulation around its application. Another point in terms of application of salts and why they may be so prominent in our urban environments is there's really not a huge set of alternatives. And where alternatives exist, they're still quite a bit more expensive, and that comes to my last point, that sodium chloride for the most part is very inexpensive and cheap, and in a lot of circumstances works pretty well. When we're looking at trees then, what are some of the signs of salt damage or toxicity? So in this case then, we can see evidence of salt damage in the zoomed in portion here. And to give you some very basic idea in terms of the mechanism concerning how salt moves, chloride from the sodium chloride then picked up or is soluble in water and moves through the tree's xylem tissue. So we'll talk in a moment about the different types of salt damage, but right now I'm speaking about salt getting into the tree from the growing medium itself. And as it migrates up, it accumulates in the tips of the leaves or needles and results in the weakening or death of leaves. And so we can, again, see some of the classic signs of that here in this image. The second type of salt damage, not coming from the soil itself, but from the air in the spray form, which Jim mentioned, is salt spray, where we have atomized particles moving in the air. Usually they're made airborne through motor vehicles. And I think Jim's analogy of the windshield of your car getting coated white as you follow a car in front of you is exactly what's happening in terms of coating of trees. And so evidence of that visually then is an accumulation on the needles or leaves and branches, and that results then in a weakening and decline of those, and we often see dieback, as is evident here. This tree that I'm showing you in the background here is in fact one of our study trees. So as we move into thinking about what's happened on the Queen's Quay scenario shortly, this is one of the trees then that was looked at in that case. Okay, so the results of this work have been in part published, and I just want to acknowledge here some of my key colleagues who worked on this project and spearheaded it. And this particular project itself also was a recipient of funding from the Tree Fund. So I wanted to acknowledge Tree Fund support in that case. Other research funding for this came from the Natural Sciences and Engineering Research Council of Canada, Ontario Centres for Excellence, and my home university, Ryerson University. So here's the Queen's Quay, sort of a bird's eye view. You can see plantings along here. This site, again, as I mentioned a few minutes ago, was revitalized in 2015 in preparation for the Pan American and Para-Pan Am Games. And in it, 154 London plane trees were planted. Underneath them, structural soil cells, again, very similar to Bloor Street. So again, also in parallel to the decisions made at Bloor, a monoculture of trees planted. And from my assessment of the literature, there's some different viewpoints on the salt tolerance of London plane trees. Some suggest moderately tolerant, but there is another body of literature that seems to suggest that they're not that tolerant of salt. And I think some of our findings might point toward the latter, at least in the case of what we've looked at here. One difference here, as I mentioned in the last bullet point, is all trees here were planted in sidewalk cutouts, so we didn't have the opportunity to distinguish between the bed planted, somewhat raised and separated from the streetscape plantings that existed in Bloor, and we were focused strictly on the cutouts in terms of where the trees were growing. Here's a diagram then of the plantings themselves. So on the left-hand side, you can see two renderings of trees, and underneath the recreation trail here, we have the structural soil cells. So the idea would be then, under optimal conditions, of course, those roots would make their way into the structural soil cells below the recreation trail. This particular project relied on passive irrigation for watering of the trees primarily. And you can see on the right-hand side there the areas in which at the edge of the trail grates, then we have receptacles for runoff. And there's a pipe system that would then carry that water into the structural soil cells, providing some irrigation for the trees. Okay, same image below, and I've annotated it with the locations in which we worked. So this study was much more of a longitudinal study, which means that we didn't have a huge replicate number of trees, but instead we followed them through time on a fairly detailed basis. So at the green circles here, we've got in-ground sensors that were measuring electroconductivity, temperature, soil moisture every 10 minutes for approximately a 3-month period. And that began just at the time the frost left the soil and continued through well into the middle of the growing season of the trees into the earlier weeks of July. In 2 locations located in blue, we have 2 water sensors where we measured electroconductivity. Again, that being a proxy for salts in the water, same as we've or as I presented it as a way to give us an indication of the general salt content within the soil. We also were interested in the temperature of the water, which gave us an indication if it was cold in some cases when we had a snow melt, and sometimes there was then a big pulse of salts into the sewer, into the catchment areas. Okay, so here's a visual of our six trees studied, and the canopy condition there, those images were taken in June 2018, June of this past summer. And so you can see that these trees are in various states of health, or perhaps better put, various states of decline. And it was those trees then visually that were studied in greater detail. Again, the species consistent across all of them was the London plane tree. Here's an image of me working at one of our sites. You can see the tree cutout here. You can see a good indication then of this recreational trail. And on the other side here, where I'm pointing with my mouse, you can see the same sort of plantings mirrored here. And with these in-ground sensors, as I mentioned a moment ago, we measured temperature, soil moisture, and then electroconductivity. And then in the basins, then electroconductivity and temperature. And here's one of these basins here itself, one of the grates then that would provide access to the structural soil cells for runoff water as a means of passive irrigation. Again, an example looking at a cross section of what things look like underground. You can see our sensor there and it measuring at 2 different depths here. Here's a picture, of course, of the setting here. This thing was buried here beside the tree. In fact, I don't know if you can see, but across there's a small white dot. This was one of our study trees, in fact, that actually had one of these sensors deployed. And they were put horizontally into the ground at these 2 different depths. This is an example of what the holes looked like here. You can actually see that some younger roots have made their way into the area surrounding the cylinders, suggesting then that whatever we did here might have created some preferential conditions for tree growth, perhaps offering more air to those roots for gas exchange, etc. Okay, so share with you some of the preliminary findings then. With regard to soil moisture, what we're looking at here is soil moisture averages across all 6 sites, across all 6 trees. The orange representative of the variance around an average value. So of course, then when we've got 6 measurements, there's going to be variability. We've captured them here in terms of standard deviation. So those of you who are familiar with what a standard deviation is, simply a measure of variance. In this case, you're seeing 1 standard deviation on either side of the average. And you can see then that there's a pretty similar tracking then of soil moisture at the two different, soil temperature rather, at the two different depths. And you can see, of course, when we started our investigation, then soil temperature is very cold. I mentioned shortly after frost leaving and moving all the way into July here, we're up in around 30 degrees Celsius. Soil moisture at the same locations. Again, what you're seeing in terms of the graphic, the same presentation of an average value with variance on either side of it, that coming about because we're combining 6 different sites here. But each of these trees studied then at the 2 different depths shows a soil moisture volumetric water content varying between about 20 and the low 30s in terms of percent. So clearly there's not really an issue of too little water in these spaces. So the notion of drought, et cetera, as a driver perhaps of tree decline wasn't something that seemed to be present in this case. I've overlaid precipitation on here just to give you an indication, and I know many of you are using would be using inches. So some of our results here in metric, I have for the depths there, giving you an indication of depths in inches in this case. So precipitation, probably the most important thing to follow simply is the shape and the pattern here, and you can see how that has provided a small influence, but not a huge influence on the overall soil moisture levels. Remember then that moisture getting into these sites then can come about generally by 2 means. One is overland flow, so water making its way across the sidewalk and bringing moisture in here, but also, of course, anything that's collected within the drainage system that I presented earlier and brought under here as a secondary source of moisture or water. And finally then electroconductivity. In this case, this was again a proxy for soil presence. Just to give you an indication of the scale on the left-hand side, values in the literature over 700 suggest that for vegetation that's has some sensitivity to salts, then 700 is usually a kind of a lower threshold of an area of concern. So consistently at depth, so at the 24 inches, the 2 feet there, we're seeing that level being approached in some cases. What again this doesn't tell us then is the types of salts that might be present in the types of elements that that may be contributing to those EC values. Okay, so very quickly then, the catch basin. Here's a more detailed view of it. You can see that we presented or created rather sensors here in some PVC pipe. They're protected in there. They're secured here below the water level. And this pipe here, this irrigation pipe, bringing water into the structural soil cells below. And they're all underneath the gate, the grates here, and there's an example of what it looks like actually in the streetscape view. Okay, and what I've then done is use that same graphic and overlaid on here our soil electroconductivity values that were measured for the sewer itself. And so the east and west sewer, we had 2 sites, and you can see then especially that pulse there, actually that correlates well with an ice storm event we had in Toronto in the first or second week of April last year. And so those values going well above that 700, raising some concern. And I think following that, you can see a tracking to some degree of an increase in electrical conductivity values in the soil. Okay, so the last thing that we looked at here was the vegetation itself, and we wanted to see whether or not different components of residual components of the road salt were manifesting themselves in the leaf and branch biomass themselves. So studying our 6 trees over 7 weeks, we undertook a fairly extensive sampling approach whereby each of those trees, leaves and branches were randomly sampled for the first 3 weeks up to bud break, and then following that for the next 7 weeks. And we looked at sodium concentrations as well as chloride concentrations. So the earlier concentrations there represented in the brownish color represent actually the smaller stems that we would have collected. They would have been growth that had occurred on the tree in the previous year, and the thought being that they may have or they may manifest some presence of sodium in this case. But also this would be a place where we could try to pick up some of that salt spray presence that was talked about as one of the 2 ways in which salts affect trees. From this point forward then, we sampled leaves. Again, the broken lines representing a standard deviation or simply the variability in the trees we studied, and the solid line representing the average. What I've done now is overlaid on here what the literature would suggest about toxicity levels. So from a simple low to extreme scale, most commonly cited as a percent dry weight is about 0.25 to 0.5. And I've color coded the graph above to show us essentially where these trees sit. So if you follow the solid line or the average line, you can see it's getting definitely into sodium toxicity territory, giving us a strong indication then that these trees, at least what's being manifested in the leaves, is being negatively impacted by salts in the soil. The same procedure then was done for tree tissue to look at chloride. Again, sampling the growth in terms of the smaller stems up until bud break, and then sampling leaves for the remaining 7 weeks. Overlaying toxicity on top of this as well, the literature suggests that for many plants, and the Lennon Plain tree included in this context, the dry weight percentages of toxicity begin to occur or show up, manifest between 0.3 and 1.0 as a percent dry weight. And so the orange color coding there suggests, of course, as well, that we see the presence of chloride at levels here that are quite extreme in terms of the context of potential damage. Okay, so that concludes the results, and I just want to draw our attention to a few key things in terms of this finding, remembering now that it focused specifically on salts, and we haven't looked at all ways to measure salt presence, but what we felt was important in terms of researchable ways that would give a fairly strong indication of whether salt was having an impact on the condition and mortality of trees in this site. So coming back to what Jim Urban mentioned at the outset of our webinar today, typically salt is not the single driver of tree decline and mortality in northern climates, but it certainly can be. So in these 2 examples then, I think it's quite clear that salt is playing a significant role. And so therefore it is important that all of us in our various ways can think about using it differently and using it perhaps less where possible. And I have a few things I just wanted to conclude by saying with regard to better tree survival where road salt is being used. So of course context, and Adam will be going into this in some detail, but knowing where we are attempting to plant and grow trees, understanding that context and understanding to some degree how humans are using that space and to what density it might be used. Ways in which we can physically design the landscape to at least prevent or buffer trees from immediate access to salt. And in the latter case, then, when we had passive irrigation, while good in principle, bringing highly salt-laden water into the structural soil cells at certain times of year may not be a terrific practice, and something then that further research might look into alternate ways to shut off that flow, for example, at some periods of time. Tree species, of course, I'm sure everybody who's watching this webinar right now is, is thinking about the notion that in both of these cases, we planted, or the tree plantings were of a single species, or a monoculture, and thinking about their tolerance to various levels of urban conditions in terms of challenges, salt specifically, and thinking perhaps more about the diversity of species that could help buffer some of those. And finally, education. So I think many people, again, who are watching the webinar are likely involved in some capacity in education. I know there's a number of workshops and even certifications available as it relates to salt application, being able to spread that information, of course, through extension and other means to people. Physical means of dealing with salt where we know it may have contaminated soil environments through flushing, using water. Water, of course, that's not contaminated salt, I think is an interesting and important area of research to pursue. And of course, then finally, alternates to salt. In an ideal world, then we would have different alternates that were much less harmful to our environment. So I'll conclude there, and I'll pass on now to Adam.
Hey guys, someone want to give me a thumbs up if you can hear? Amazing, great. Okay, great to be getting a chance to chat to everyone.
And before you start, Jim, here, we've gotten a lot of questions about CEUs. And I think Megan will address that when we get to the very end of this. Megan will give a little short piece on getting CEU. Yeah. Thank you.
Great. So we're going to run through 7 pieces of advice that we've discussed as a group and wanted to share. There may be others, and maybe that'll come up in the questions. I'm going to go through each one of these individually, so I won't list them right now. But next slide, please, Andrew. Be aware that they really work at 2 different levels, and both levels are important, or both lenses are important to try and get better success rates with this topic. So there's a planning level consideration, and there's a detail level consideration. As we go through from 1 to 7, we're really going to find that some of them speak more towards just practical strategies for retrofitting, where you don't have too much opportunity to reorganize the street or the park or the place where you're working. But up front, there are some things which we should start to embed in terms of practice, which are going to make the problem a lot more tangible and easier to solve in the longer run. So with that, none of these are going to be a huge surprise, I don't think, to most practitioners, but in some ways, the strategies for dealing with salt are really consistent with best practices for, any instance where you're planting an urban tree, but if anything, it makes a lot of these instances more important. In fact, we just have to make sure we get some of the fundamentals absolutely right. Next slide, please. Okay, so this is a picture I took a few weeks ago. It's not snow that you're seeing on the ground, it's salt. We're not trying to blow this, the context out of proportion, but we're seeing a ton of salt for a lot of the reasons that Andrew said, fear of liability and fear of slipping outweighing the fear of the damage it can cause to the environment or from the tree's point of view. So you're going to experience very different levels of salt depending on where you're working, and actually making sure you're understanding where you're working is the most important thing you can do. Be aware of where you're working. The level of salt will not be the same, and in any large project, you may get a bunch of different situations which need different levels of intervention. Next slide, please. This is from Jim's book, 11 years ago, and it's simply to say that a lot of the fundamental considerations of where you plant a tree, planting the easiest place first, seem to coincide with the lowest areas for salt exposure and damage. And I think a few of the projects you've seen and some of the failure we're seeing is when we're still trying to find technological solutions to working round number 3 on the diagram here, which is already the hardest place to plant and is the area where, as you track the salt runoff that you can expect to see from a salted street or sidewalk, most of it's going to be getting into that tree's growing environment. Next slide, please, Andrew. Thanks. So in terms of where you are, just think in terms of, practically speaking, what chance are you creating for salt to get into a growing space? And indeed, are you even inviting it in? I've just used 3 examples here. Jim had more on his slide, but be aware that at a high-end retail street, and this picture is a Bloor Street, but there are many others. Here you have the highest expectations for snow clearing. People who are visiting these kind of environments, shopkeepers and businesses are very aware of their experience in terms of winter, and you can expect a lot of snow. And we've seen it on Bloor Street, massive amounts of snow, not just put down by the city, but the businesses as well. You do have higher budgets to work with in most instances, but often those budgets aren't necessarily going to the tree technology, but they can. So that's something of a saving grace. And the design of a street is sometimes more, or at least the surface interface of tree and sidewalk may not be just from the purest point of view of what's best for the tree. There are other considerations in terms of space and aesthetics and urban design. So you may be getting into mechanical solutions such as valves, and even in some instances we've seen on projects heated pavements, so not using salt. The local retail street or the kind of higher density residential street sits somewhere in between these two. You'll have normal expectations for snow clearing. You'll have a mid-range budget, and the practical solutions for addressing this could fall in between, in such as you could start to look at raising trees in planters. The example we're given here is Dundas Street East in Toronto. Amazing trees very quickly. It was planted around about the same time as some of the projects you saw that Andrew talked about on less budget, but still got amazing results. We have great trees in Toronto, so let's not think that this is a hopeless battle. And then the last example over on the right, the least salt possible, the residential street. And when we're recreating this kind of environment, you can see here this is one that already exists, a local neighborhood street. We're getting great tree growth here. The solutions are usually the most frugal runs. They're just really a reorganization of the street to just simply get the tree away from the salt. So you can imagine how water drains in the snow melt on this street. It's all directed away from the tree, and the budget doesn't have to account for such things as soil cells or tree grates or pre-protection. This is low-hanging fruit if we simply arrange the street in a prudent manner. Next slide, please, Andrew. So this is something that foresters have been telling practitioners for countless decades, and it's worth pointing out from a point of view of salt. It's usually been couched in terms of the urban forest resilience to disease, but when we introduce salt into the mix as well, it's no less an effective method for ensuring that you don't get system failure. So system failure would be an instance where you backed one horse or one species of tree, and you get a massive failure which causes the entire street or park to be replanted. This picture of these fine elms in Cornwall, Connecticut, gives us an idea of what we're striving for. But also bear in mind that we'd hate to rule out any one species. As Andrew said, there's conflicting evidence on whether, for instance, London plains are a viable option in an urban environment with salt. We would hate to not see any more London plains in the Toronto environment, but maybe by using biodiversity, we can make sure that we can try them, but without experiencing the chance of complete and utter failure. Next slide. The third suggestion we're making on a planning level is that we just maybe adjust our expectations in terms of what we want to achieve in a street. So, you know, here's some pretty great London plane trees in Shanghai, the French Quarter, and anyone who's been lucky to be there, and you can certainly sense it from the pictures, this is golden green light of canopy above you, and the trees seem to magically just disappear into the sidewalk. It's almost an impossible paradigm, and one that we tried to copy at our own peril. And really what we're saying with this kind of piece of advice, if you flip to the next slide, please, Andrew. Great. But there may be other ways which we can adapt to an urban situation. So we're starting to look at models with Jim of successional tree planting, which are more robust in terms of an ecology. They may take a little bit more room in a reorganization of some of the urban fabric, but we believe they can be miniaturized. And it's an arrangement of a street which just is a little less rigid, therefore it doesn't highlight the problems as acutely as a more formal arrangement. Next slide, please. So this is just an example of what that might look like. This is an example in Paris, whereby you're not backing any one winner. So you're putting in place a more robust urban ecology. In an instance where you're going to experience salts, you can imagine that a more contemporary landscape like this could be more able to absorb failure and then still seem like a successful project, and becomes valuable research in terms of monitoring and understanding better approaches for salt environments. Next slide, please, Andrew. So hitting about the middle of, this is number 4 of 7, at a planning level and also a detail level, one of the easiest wins here from a point of view of putting trees in an urban environment when you're out in a hard surface is raising the planter. So there are tons of, first of all, of course, Andrew's work has borne that out, where he's seen the raised planters in tandem with flush planters on Bloor Street. He's seen higher mortality rates from the flush planters, better results in raised planters. There are tons of examples in Toronto, maybe you know some of the cities that you work in, where we're seeing these two types of planting together in close proximity with similar soil volumes available. We're getting better results from raised planters. Of course, there could be other factors at play here, but success is success in terms of growing trees. And there seems to be a logical, there seems to be a strong logic for just making common sense moves to limit the chance of salt runoff of getting into a planting space. And the results, at least at this point, seem to speak for themselves. It's an easy win. The fifth one, of course, we're supposed to be inviting water into tree planting spaces. So if you just advance the next slide, please, Andrew. Great. So we're at this strange juncture of our work where trees are also seen as a really viable tool in terms of stormwater management. They're absorptive and you get evapotranspiration, but we're aware of the differences between working in, say, Portland and say Kitchener, Ontario, where putting the tree inside the bioswale could cause some issues. Now, I take a pause here and say that there are still many advantages to combining these two systems. We're always fighting for soil volume on a street, and it's still one of the best ways of ensuring success is to, as Jim has often pointed out, getting the volume of soil available to tree up as much as possible. So turning down soil seems counterintuitive, but there are risks which we need to weigh up and build into final designs. Next slide, please. So where we're mixing the two, it may just be that we need a little bit more room. So in street redesign, close proximity of most acute and concentrated salt runoff and the tree is certainly going to be a riskier business, depending on the kind of environment you're in and whether you're getting a lot of salt runoff or a lot of salt. It would be a good idea for strategies such as this, where you're mixing the tree environment and the salt runoff environment on purpose, to consider either mechanical separation, which we'll talk about later, or whether you're actually in an environment where it's not such a big deal, or whether you can use biodiversity to ensure that, again, you don't get that complete system failure. Next slide, please. And then the other option is, of course, you separate the two out. So this is an image from the Philadelphia Green Street Manual. On the left is an image of a a planning exercise we're doing right now for a new neighborhood near Toronto. And the decision here was made on some streets to simply change or separate out the collection of salt and the kind of plant life that we're trying to grow in it and the tree environment. It's widened some of those key streets, so that has implications as well in terms of spatial design and economics, but it's taken the mixing of the two out of the equation. There are other instances in this project where we are mixing the tree environment and the salt environment, because we believe that the levels of salt that we're going to see there are simply not going to be a huge issue. Now, there's a really great article that's just come out in ASLA magazine, that's the Ontario Association's ground magazine, which Jen Hill wrote and is worth checking out. She has 3 different plantings in the west end of Toronto on the Queensway, and one instance is a regular tree planting detail from like circa 10, 20 years ago. One is using soil cells with stormwater going in, including salt, of course, from road salt, and the other one is cut off from any water going in. She's still finding that in that environment, which is a local high street, it's better to bring the water in, even though it has salt in, than to not. So the best tree growth they're seeing there is bringing in salt water. So again, it really depends on where you're working. Next slide, please, Andrew. Great. Drainage. And if you're bringing water in, we really, as practitioners, need to have a pretty good sense of whether that water is getting out again. That means we have to have geotechnical advice on board. We have to have an understanding of the soils. We have to know if water is getting out. And if it's not getting out, we need to find a way to get it out. Otherwise, we're going to experience a buildup of salt over time. Jim can maybe talk to us later with the questions, but it is incredibly hard to flush out salt once it gets into the system. It takes a huge amount of water. The next slide, please. This is the last general piece of advice. If you're in an area where you are encouraging water in, and the design is such that you can do it, there are plenty of devices now available where, as you bring in passive irrigation, you can choose to have a seasonal shut-off valve whereby you're bringing in passive irrigation in the warmer weather, which is clean water, or at least it's salt-free. And then there is a shut-off valve which then diverts the storm water into the regular storm system. So it's as simple as, you know, the kind of device you see in a playground, on or off. Next slide, please, Andrew. And physically, it just looks like linear drain. There's a few manufacturers that are doing these now. It really means that just at some point, just the same as an irrigation system, you're going to go around and shut these off for winter, and you're going to turn them on again for spring. We should bear in mind, of course, that this means that salt water is directed back into the storm system again. So we haven't done anything to alleviate the bigger problem of salt runoff from streets, but we may have, in some very high salt risk areas, addressed the issue of the tree mortality. So the last slide, please, Andrew. Thanks. Looking at whether we combine some of these strategies, and if we're diverting seasonally, diverting salt water away, whether we actually consider diverting it to specific beds. So there's a separation again. It's a combination of the seasonal valve strategy and the separation of a bioswale from the tree space. And we actually plant salt-specific beds, which can be absorptive season by season of the diverted salt water. So rather than simply flushing it through the storm system, we're still accountable for where the salt goes. That's what I've got. I'm going to pause there and leave plenty of time for questions then. Thanks.
Okay. Thank you very much, Adam and Andrew. Jim Urban here again. I've been trying to look at the primary questions that have come up. There's a lot of repeats. You guys are great. You've been firing all kinds of stuff at us. Megan, did you have just a quick thought on the CEUs? There were a lot of questions on CEUs.
Yep.
But
Yep.
can they just contact you?
I don't want to receive hundreds of emails. So no, please don't email me unless you have a specific question. But when you registered for this webinar, if you did it correctly, you would have seen that at the bottom, there were spots for placing your information for identification numbers for ISA, SAF, LACES, NALP kind of CEUs. So if you put your information in there, you're good to go. So if you didn't put your information in there, then you need to email me. That's the way we're going to do it from now on. So please go ahead and send me an email and explain what sort of CEUs you need. Before we start doing the question and answer, we are 9 minutes over our hour allotted time. So I'm going to let you guys determine how much time you want to take for questions. We still have about 830 people in the meeting room right now. So obviously this is a really important webinar topic. I'm going to launch the poll right now. So if you all could take a second to answer the poll and just move it off your screen. If you don't want to answer it right now, that's no problem. I'm just going to leave it open and then hand it over to Jim. He's going to administer however many questions he wants to do. And yeah, there we go. Okay.
Well, a lot of the answers to a lot of these questions, very, very specific ones, is we need an awful lot more research to sort through these problems. The research we presented today was obviously looking at trees in a real environment, and there are all kinds of other things that get thrown at the tree that are hard to sort through. A controlled research project in a greenhouse or controlled fields gives us much more refined data, but it is also hard then to replicate what is really happening in the urban environment. Both approaches are needed, but we just need a lot more research. And the Tree and Soil Research Fund for Landscape Architecture is one attempt to do that. So hopefully you'll consider donating to that particular tree fund. There was a number of questions about figuring out species. This is a very local thing, and so you really need to look around and see what trees that are in a salt situation that is similar to what you think you're going to have, and how those are doing. And I've been in many cities where it's pretty easy to do that. The best time to look at that is in late summer. That's when your trees will start showing salt. Salts in the leaves mid to late summer when it really gets hot. The trees declining earlier, because they all look good in the spring, but by late summer the trees that were not tolerant of salt are beginning to show their decline. The best single list I've ever seen is from the city of Denver, Colorado. They have a huge list of salt tolerant plants. They also break out air tolerance versus water tolerance, and I know nobody else that's done that. So go to the Denver Urban Forest website, really good start. There was a question about how far back from the salt source do you need to be, and wind carried salt can go a long way, but generally, again, I would look at look around your own environment, and you'll see that the salt impact is actually usually pretty close to roads. You can measure, there'll be measurable salt impacts by the time you get 50 or 60 feet away from the road, but the majority of the trees that really have the problems are those that are really quite close. A number of people say, well, why don't we just use less salt? We can certify the salt people, we can create regulations and laws, and the reality of all of that is that your community has to stand up and say, we demand this. this is where I think landscape architects as a group and urban foresters and arborists can get together and really work on their local politicians to make these things happen. But it's not going to happen without a huge amount of effort. And it gets back to the trees and science versus trees and people. You're going to need a lot of allies to make that actually work. There were a number of questions about the actual design of the silva cells in these projects and whether they went under the ground. Andrew did show a drawing, and yes, all of the trees that were looked at were interconnected with silva cells completely from tree to tree. Interestingly, there was this other study on some trees that were not in the central business district. Somebody wanted to know what CBD was, central business district. And there they saw the opposite effect, that the trees that were in the silva cells, even though they were in a flush planter, did much better, even though there was salt water being directed right from the road into the soil within the cells. Again, I think that where you are, the amount of salt you're talking about will make a huge difference. Let's see, alternatives to salt. Many questions about alternatives to salt. Again, that's as much a political issue. So for example, using sand or wood chips or salt brine, you've got to sell those ideas to your local Department of Public Works, and that's going to take a community effort, one or two people, or even the local chapter of the ASLA is not going to be able to solve that problem. It's going to take a much broader constituency. And yes, some of these other ideas do less damage and often can cost less. But you have to break through a lot of built-in barriers. Let's see, there was a question about getting the slides. Several people asked, can we get this presentation? Megan, do you have any problem?
It's totally up to Adam and Andrew. If they feel open to sharing it, I can put it on our website easily.
Okay. Well, I'm going to bet that they won't have a problem with that. And so if it doesn't show up on the website, you'll know why it didn't. But I'm pretty sure we'll be able to make that happen. And we really need to, the goal here is to get out the information. A couple of questions about how do you measure salt in the ground, and you can do that with you can do it by taking salt samples. There are some electro conductivity meters that you can get. Phil Krall, in his book on urban soils from way back when, let's see, it was 1990s, I think, talks about, I think it's 2 decisiemens of electroconductivity is his threshold for salt, or if you're measuring it in parts per million, it's about 400 to 500 parts per million was his threshold for the beginning of too much salt in the soil. But you can get that information from Phil Krall's book, Urban Soils. Very, very good source. If you're in this business, you should have that. And also, I think I put that up by roots, so you can find it there. Let's see.
I might ask Andrew to unshare his screen so that the folks can see our faces a little bit, or not my face, obviously, but yeah, there you go. Awesome.
Okay. Oh, there I am. I guess that's me. So those were the primary questions. There were a few questions that I answered online if I could see a quick little thing, and I didn't think they were necessarily needed by the whole group, although we really hope that this presentation starts a dialogue in your own community amongst yourselves. All the information that we presented here is all easily available. The research is all published. So please start that dialogue and figure out how you can bring that dialogue with landscape architects, planners, urban foresters, and arborists. All need to get together on this issue in salt-prone areas and bring a common discussion to the public realm. But don't forget that your strongest allies are the environmentalists, and the civil engineers themselves understand how much damage salt can do to infrastructure. And so I think that would be pretty important. Okay, any follow-up comments from Andrew or Adam? We're down to only about 120 people left, but thank you all for sticking in there.
No, we still have 605. We have 122 questions.
Oh, 622 questions, you're right. Yeah, so we have 122 questions. We're not going to get to it. Adam or Andrew, any follow-up, correcting anything I might have said, or something you'd like to add?
No, you said it all really well, Jim. You know, there's really maybe the takeaways from the point of view of what I was looking at. We're making a problem in the first place in some instances by the way we're arranging streets, and but that said, there's still many things that we can do once we get into details to just increase our odds. You know, when it's not an exact science, just look for as many ways that we can increase our odds. One thing that just occurred to me, and maybe it's a question to Andrew, it would be great to, instead of always be doing post-mortems of these kind of instances where trees have died, but having a more active monitoring role. So whereby when you do a project, the monitoring is built in and adjustments made as you go along. Is that feasible with the kind of equipment that you have?
It absolutely is, Adam, and I'm glad you raised it, because I was going to approach you about just such a project. So maybe we could, we could talk about some sort of a collaboration there. I'd also just like to mention to everybody who's still on the webinar, if you'd like to ask me anything more about the research that we conducted, or you have some ideas for research that you feel is essential in this arena, please don't hesitate to contact me. I'm easily findable at Ryerson University. Just put my name and the university in the search engine, and you can find my email address. I'm happy to dialogue with you there. Oh, and I think Megan has just put it out there. So great, thank you very much. So again, I'm happy to talk further or to explain anything further about what we did. And of course, there's important acknowledgement of, there's lots of limitations to the studies. The studies were fairly focused. There's lots of things, of course, we could have looked at that we didn't. But I think that overall, the picture pointed quite strongly to the role of salt in these two locations anyway being quite important drivers of tree decline.
Okay, well, I thank everybody who's still listening. Thank our two presenters. Thanks to Megan and the University of Utah. Did I get that right?
Utah State, that's all right. Yeah, thanks for joining us today. It was good to have everybody. I really appreciate this, and we will have this webinar up on our website probably in the next couple days or so. So have a wonderful rest of your day, everyone.
Okay.
Thank you.